The glittering facade of Blake Thompson's empire crumbled as he huddled in a frozen alley, the stench of urine and despair assaulting his senses. How had the city's most ruthless real estate tycoon found himself here, among the very people he'd displaced, fighting for survival on the merciless streets he once ruled? Blake's manicured hands trembled as he pulled his threadbare coat tighter, the icy wind cutting through the thin fabric like knives. Just days ago, he'd been standing atop his latest skyscraper, champagne flute in hand, surveying the sprawling cityscape of New Haven like a king. Now, the towering monuments to his success cast long, accusing shadows over the huddled forms of the homeless himself included. The irony wasn't lost on him. For years, Blake had masterfully orchestrated the gentrification of entire neighborhoods. His vision of urban renewal leaving a trail of displaced families and shattered communities in its wake. He justified it all in the name of progress and profit, dismissing the protests and pleas of activists as the misguided cries of those who didn't understand the necessities of business. But now, as he watched a young mother struggle to quiet her crying infant in a nearby doorway, the cold reality of his actions began to seep into his bones. Colder even in the unforgiving concrete beneath him. It had started as a publicity stunt, a way to prove to those annoying protesters that the homeless situation wasn't that bad. He'd planned to spend a week undercover, gathering anecdotes about how the system worked and how those with initiative could easily pull themselves up by their bootstraps. Instead, he found himself stripped of his identity, his power, and his illusions about the world he'd helped create. The first night had been the hardest. Used to silk sheets and climate-controlled comfort, Blake had tossed and turned on the hard ground, every sound magnified in the darkness. The distant wail of sirens, the scuttling of rats, the occasional shout or breaking glass, each noise a reminder of how far he'd fallen and how vulnerable he truly was. By morning, exhaustion had settled into his bones, mixing with a gnawing hunger he'd never experienced before. His first attempt to find food had been a humiliating disaster. Accustomed to being treated with deference, he'd approached a cafe, planning to charm his way into a free meal. Instead, he'd been met with suspicious glares and a curt dismissal, the staff eyeing his disheveled appearance with barely concealed disgust. It was then that Blake had his first real taste of invisibility. As he wandered the streets, he noticed how people's gazes seemed to slide right past him as if he didn't exist. The same business executives who would have fawned over him days ago now quickened their pace as they passed, clutching their briefcases tighter. On the third day, desperate and disoriented, Blake had stumbled into a homeless shelter. The stark fluorescent lights and institutional smell had assaulted his senses, but it was the sea of weary faces that truly shook him. Each person there had a story, he realized, lives as complex and valuable as his own. And yet he dismissed them all as statistics, mere obstacles in his path to greater wealth and influence. It was there that he met Marcus Washington, a grizzled veteran with eyes that had seen too much. Marcus had taken one look at Blake's bewildered expression and taken him under his wing, showing him the ropes of survival on the streets. Together, they navigated the labyrinthine bureaucracy of social services, fought for spots in overcrowded shelters, and learned the unwritten rules of life on the margins of society. As days turned into a week, Blake found himself transformed. The hunger, the cold, the constant state of alertness, they wore away at his ego like sandpaper, stripping him down to his core. He began to see the city through new eyes, noticing details he'd overlooked for years. The hostile architecture designed to prevent the homeless from resting, the judgmental stares of passers-by, the sheer exhaustion of constantly being unwanted and unwelcome. It all painted a picture of a system designed to punish poverty rather than alleviate it. One particularly cold night, huddled with Marcus and a group of others around a makeshift fire in an abandoned lot, Blake had an epiphany. He listened as his companions shared their stories of job loss, medical bankruptcies, domestic violence, and mental health struggles. Each tale was an indictment of the society he'd helped shape, a society that discarded people as easily as it razed old buildings to make way for luxury condos. It was then that Blake made a decision. He couldn't continue this charade any longer. He had the power to make real change, to use his wealth and influence for something more than just accumulating more wealth and influence. But first, he needed to understand more, to truly walk in the shoes of those he displaced for so long. As Blake drifted off to an uneasy sleep that night, the flickering flames casting dancing shadows on the crumbling walls around them, he felt a sense of purpose stirring within him. He didn't know exactly how yet, but he was determined to make amends, to find a way to build a city that worked for everyone, not just the privileged few. Little did he know, his journey was far from over. The lessons he'd learned on the streets were just the beginning. The real test would come when he tried to bridge the vast chasm between his old world and this new reality he'd discovered. As dawn broke over the city, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, Blake steeled himself for the challenges ahead. He was no longer just Blake Thompson, real estate mogul. He was a man on a mission, determined to rewrite the story of New Haven and perhaps, in the process, redeem his own soul. In the days that followed, Blake immersed himself deeper into the world he'd previously viewed only from a comfortable distance. He volunteered at soup kitchens, learning the names and stories of regulars who came for their daily meals. He attended support group meetings for addicts struggling to stay clean, witnesses to the devastating impact of a healthcare system that failed those most in need. It was during one of these meetings that Blake met Olivia Chun, a dedicated social worker whose passion for her work shone through her tired eyes. At first, Olivia regarded Blake with suspicion, sensing something different about this seemingly new face among the homeless community. But as days passed and Blake's genuine desire to learn and help became apparent, a cautious friendship began to form. Olivia became Blake's guide to the intricate web of social services, showing him both the tireless efforts of those trying to make a difference and the frustrating bureaucracy that often hindered real progress. Through her, Blake gained insight into the daily struggles faced not just by the homeless, but by the working poor teetering on the edge of destitution. As Blake's understanding grew, so did his restlessness. He itched to reveal his true identity, to start implementing the changes he now saw were so desperately needed. But something held him back, a nagging fear that once he stepped back into his old life, the visceral reality of what he'd experienced would fade like a dream. It was Marcus who inadvertently pushed Blake to confront this fear. One evening, as they shared a meager meal in a secluded corner of the park, Marcus began to open up about his past. He spoke of a modest but happy life in a close-knit community, of neighbors who looked out for each other despite their individual struggles. His voice grew bitter as he recounted how it all changed, how developers had swept in, buying up properties and forcing longtime residents out with skyrocketing rents and property taxes. With a jolt of recognition, Blake realized Marcus was describing one of his own early projects, a neighborhood he'd revitalized without a second thought for the lives he was uprooting. The weight of this revelation settled in his chest like a stone, making it hard to breathe. Marcus must have sensed Blake's distress, for he paused his story and fixed him with a penetrating gaze. "You okay there, friend?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Blake swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry. This was the moment of truth. He could continue his charade, or he could come clean and face the consequences of his actions. Taking a deep breath, he made his choice. "Marcus," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "there's something I need to tell. I'm not who you think I am." As Blake's true identity spilled out, along with the story of his week-long experiment in homelessness, he watched a myriad of emotions play across Marcus's weathered face: shock, anger, betrayal, and finally, a grudging respect for Blake's willingness to learn and change. The conversation that followed was one of the most difficult of Blake's life. Marcus didn't hold back, laying bare the full impact of Blake's business practices on real people's lives. But he also listened as Blake shared his newfound understanding and his desperate desire to make amends. By the time dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of hope, a tentative plan had formed. Blake would return to his old life, but with a new mission. He would use his wealth, his influence, and his insider knowledge of the real estate world to create real, lasting change in New Haven. As Blake stood to leave, preparing to reclaim his identity and face the world he'd left behind, Marcus gripped his arm. "Don't forget us when you're back in your tower," he said, his eyes intense. "Remember what you've seen, what you felt. You have the power to make a difference. Use it." Blake nodded solemnly, the weight of his newfound responsibility settling on his shoulders. He knew the path ahead would be fraught with challenges. He would face skepticism from both his old associates and those he aimed to help. But for the first time in his life, he felt truly alive, driven by a purpose greater than his own profit. As he walked away, Blake turned for one last look at the makeshift community that had been his home for the past week. In that moment, he made a silent vow. He would not rest until New Haven became a city where no one had to sleep on its streets, where opportunity and compassion flourished side by side. The real work was just beginning. Blake's return to his former life was like stepping into a surreal parallel universe. The plush carpet of his penthouse felt alien beneath his feet. The silence of the climate-controlled rooms oppressive after the constant background noise of the streets. As he stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows, gazing out at the city he thought he knew, Blake felt a profound sense of disconnection. His wife, Rachel, had greeted his return with a mixture of relief and suspicion. She'd been told he was on a secret business retreat, out of contact for strategic reasons. Now, as she observed the haunted look in his eyes and the new, hardened set of his jaw, she sensed a fundamental shift in the man she'd married. "Blake, darling," she ventured, her voice careful. "Are you sure you're all right? You seem different." He turned to face her, seeing her perfectly coiffed hair and designer outfit with new eyes. How many times had he dismissed her concerns about the less fortunate as naive bleeding heart sentiment? How often had he scoffed at her tentative suggestions of philanthropy, arguing that business success was the ultimate form of social responsibility? "I'm fine, Rachel," he replied, his voice hoarse. "But we need to talk. There are going to be some changes around here. Over the next few days, Blake threw himself into research, poring over reports on urban poverty, affordable housing initiatives, and social enterprise models. He called emergency meetings with his executive team, much to their bewilderment. The Blake Thompson they knew was ruthlessly focused on profit margins and market expansion. This new Blake, with his talk of corporate social responsibility and sustainable development, was a stranger to them. His oldest friend and business partner, David Reeves, was the first to confront him directly. "Blake, what the hell is going on?" he demanded, cornering him after a particularly heated board meeting. "You disappear for a week and come back talking like some kind of socialist. We have shareholders to answer to, for God's sake." Blake met David's gaze steadily, remembering countless nights they'd spent strategizing over expensive whiskey, plotting their next big acquisition. "David," he said quietly, "I've seen things, experienced things that have changed me. We've been operating in a bubble, blind to the real impact of our actions. It's time we took responsibility for the world we're creating." David's expression cycled through disbelief, concern, and finally, a grudging curiosity. "You're serious about this, aren't you?" he asked, studying Blake's face closely. "More serious than I've ever been about anything," Blake confirmed. "And I need your help. You're the best financial mind I know. If we're going to make this work, to create real change while still running a viable business, I need you on board." As the weeks passed, Blake's vision began to take shape. He proposed a radical overhaul of their business model, focusing on mixed-income housing developments, urban renewal projects that prioritized existing communities, and partnerships with local social services. It was an uphill battle, facing resistance from skeptical board members and nervous investors. But Blake was a man transformed, attacking each challenge with the same relentless determination that had made him a titan of industry. He brought in experts, crunched numbers, and painted a compelling picture of a future where profit and social good could coexist. Slowly, reluctantly, the tide began to turn. David, won over by Blake's passion and the intellectual challenge of this new approach, became his staunchest ally. Together, They began to reshape the company from the inside out. However, Blake soon realized that corporate change alone wasn't enough. The systemic issues he'd witnessed required a broader approach. He began reaching out to city officials, nonprofit leaders, and community organizers, many of whom regarded him with understandable suspicion. It was during one of these outreach efforts that Blake reconnected with Olivia Chun, the social worker he'd met during his time on the streets. Her surprise at seeing him in his true identity quickly gave way to cautious hope as he explained his transformation and his plans. Thompson, she said, her tone guarded but curious. I have to admit, this is unexpected. What exactly are you proposing? Blake leaned forward, his eyes alight with purpose. A partnership, Miss Chun. Your expertise, your connections to the community, combined with my resources and influence. Together, we could create a model for urban development that actually serves all citizens, not just the wealthy few. Olivia listened intently as Blake outlined his ideas: affordable housing initiatives, job training programs, integrated social services. She asked tough questions, challenging his assumptions and pushing him to consider angles he hadn't thought of. By the end of their meeting, a tentative alliance had formed. As word of Blake's transformation spread, it sparked a mix of reactions. Some hailed him as a visionary, while others dismissed his efforts as a publicity stunt or a midlife crisis. The business press vacillated between fascination and skepticism, running profiles that ranged from glowing to scathing. Blake found unexpected allies in unlikely places. Young urban planners and socially conscious entrepreneurs reached out, eager to contribute to this new vision. Some of his old business rivals, intrigued by the potential for both profit and positive press, began to explore similar initiatives, but not everyone was on board with Blake's new direction. A vocal contingent of shareholders, led by a particularly aggressive hedge fund manager, began to agitate for his removal as CEO. They argued that his misguided altruism was destroying shareholder value and jeopardizing the company's future. The pressure mounted, and Blake found himself fighting battles on multiple fronts. He worked tirelessly, pushing himself to the limit as he juggled the demands of running his company, implementing his new initiatives, and defending his vision to skeptics on all sides. The strain began to show in his personal life as well. Rachel, initially supportive of what she saw as a charitable phase, grew increasingly frustrated with Blake's all-consuming focus on his new mission. The glamorous social life they'd once shared fell by the wayside as Blake poured every ounce of his energy into his work. One evening, after Blake missed yet another important charity gala, Rachel confronted him in his home office. "Blake, this has to stop," she pleaded, her voice tight with emotion. "You're running yourself into the ground. And for what? You can't save everyone, you know?" Blake looked up from his desk, scattered with plans for a new mixed-income housing development. He saw the worry in Rachel's eyes, mixed with a growing resentment. For a moment, he felt a pang of longing for the simpler life they'd had before, the easy luxury, the uncomplicated pursuit of success. But then he remembered Marcus's face, the weary determination of the people he'd met in the shelters and on the streets. He thought of Olivia, working tirelessly to make a difference with far fewer resources than he had at his disposal. "I'm sorry, Rachel," he said softly. "I know this isn't what you signed up for, but I can't go back to who I was before. I've seen too much, understood too much. This work is not just a phase or a charity project. It's who I am now." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken words and shifting realities. Rachel nodded slowly, a mix of sadness and resignation in her eyes. "I see," she said quietly. "I just hope you know what you're doing." As she left the room, Blake turned back to his work, the weight of his choices settling on his shoulders. He knew the path ahead would be difficult, fraught with challenges, both personal and professional. But he also felt a sense of purpose, a driving force that gave meaning to every obstacle he faced. Blake Thompson, once the poster child for ruthless capitalism, was now embarking on a journey to redefine success, not just for himself, but for an entire city. The real test of his transformation was yet to come. As he prepared to face his greatest challenge yet, convincing a world driven by profit to see the value in compassion and community. As the crisp autumn air settled over New Haven, Blake found himself standing before a crowded town hall meeting, the culmination of months of planning and negotiations. The atmosphere was tense, a palpable mix of hope, skepticism, and barely contained hostility. "Ladies and gentlemen," Blake began, his voice steady despite the butterflies in his stomach. "I stand before you today, not as the Blake Thompson you think you know, but as a man transformed by experience and driven by a new purpose." He paused, scanning the faces before him. In the front row, he saw Olivia Chung, offering a small nod of encouragement. Further back, Marcus Washington sat with a group of community activists, his expression guarded but attentive. Blake's executive team occupied one side of the room, while city officials and local business leaders filled the other. For years, I've been part of a system that prioritized profit over people, that saw our city as nothing more than a series of investment opportunities. I was blind to the real cost of my actions, to the lives disrupted and communities torn apart in the name of progress. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Blake pressed on, his voice gaining strength. "But I've had my eyes opened. I've walked the streets of our city not as a powerful CEO, but as a man with nothing. I've seen firsthand the struggles faced by those we've left behind in our rush for development. I'm here today to tell you that it's time for a change." Over the next hour, Blake laid out his vision for a new kind of urban development. He spoke of mixed-income housing projects that would integrate affordable units seamlessly with market-rate apartments. He detailed plans for community centers that would offer job training, childcare, and health services. He outlined a revolutionary profit-sharing model that would ensure local residents benefited directly from new developments in their neighborhoods. As he spoke, Blake could see the mood in the room shifting. The initial skepticism began to give way to curiosity, and in some cases, cautious optimism. Even some of his harshest critics seemed to be listening with renewed interest. But the real test came during the question and answer session that followed. A local union leader stood up, his voice gruff with suspicion. "Mr. Thompson, this all sounds great on paper. But how do we know this isn't just another corporate PR stunt? How can we trust that you'll follow through?" Blake met the man's gaze steadily. "You're right to be skeptical," he acknowledged. "I haven't earned your trust yet, but I'm not asking you to take my word for it. I'm here to propose a partnership. Every step of this process will be transparent, with community oversight and input. We'll set concrete benchmarks and be held accountable to them. This isn't about me playing savior. It's about all of us working together to build a better New Haven." The questions continued, ranging from technical inquiries about financing to passionate pleas for specific neighborhood needs. Blake fielded each one with a combination of honesty, expertise, and humility, not afraid to admit when he didn't have all the answers, but always emphasizing his commitment to finding solutions collaboratively. As the meeting drew to a close, Blake could sense a shift in the energy of the room. There was still caution, still doubt, but also a growing current of excitement, a sense of possibility that hadn't been there before. Olivia approached him as the crowd began to disperse. "That was impressive," she said, a hint of surprise in her voice. "You really meant everything you said, didn't you?" Blake nodded, feeling both exhausted and exhilarated. "Every word. But this is just the beginning. We have a lot of work ahead of us." Over the following months, that work consumed every aspect of Blake's life. He threw himself into the implementation of his plans with the same intensity he'd once devoted to acquiring new properties and maximizing profits. The first test of his new approach came with the redevelopment of Riverside, a struggling neighborhood that had long been Blake's company's crosshairs for gentrification. Instead of the luxury condos originally planned, Blake's team worked closely with local residents and community organizations to design a mixed-use development that would serve the existing community while also attracting new investment. It wasn't an easy process. There were heated debates over design elements, funding allocations, and the balance between preserving neighborhood character and encouraging economic growth. Blake found himself mediating disputes between various stakeholders, often working late into the night to find compromises that would keep the project moving forward. But slowly, painstakingly, progress was made. The groundbreaking ceremony for the Riverside project was a moment of triumph tinged with nervous anticipation. As Blake stood with community leaders, local officials, and residents to turn the first shovelful of dirt, he felt the weight of their collective hopes and fears. "This is more than just a building project," he said to the gathered crowd. "This is about showing that there's a different way to develop our cities, a way that lifts everyone up instead of pushing people out. We're not just constructing apartments and storefronts, we're building a community." As construction began, Blake's days became a whirlwind of activity. He shuttled between job sites, community meetings, and his corporate offices, working to keep all the moving parts of his vision in sync. He hired local workers whenever possible, implemented job training programs, and personally oversaw the integration of social services into the development plans. The strain began to show, both professionally and personally. Some of his old business associates distanced themselves, uncomfortable with his new approach. The pressure from profit-focused shareholders continued to mount, with increasingly vocal calls for his resignation. At home, the rift between Blake and Rachel widened. She struggled to understand his new passion, missing the glamorous lifestyle they'd once shared. Their conversations became stilted, filled with awkward silences and unspoken resentments. One evening, after another late night at the office, Blake returned home to find Rachel waiting for him, her bags packed. "I can't do this anymore, Blake," she said, her voice a mix of sadness and resignation. "I don't recognize you or this life we're living. I need some time, some space to figure things out." Blake felt a pang of guilt and regret, realizing how much he'd neglected his marriage in pursuit of his new mission. But as he watched Rachel leave, he also felt a strange sense of clarity. The path he'd chosen was difficult, lonely at times, but he knew in his heart it was the right one. As news of his separation spread, Blake threw himself even more intensely into his work. He found solace in the tangible progress being made, in the gradual transformation of Riverside from a neglected neighborhood to a vibrant, integrated community. The project wasn't without its setbacks. Construction delays, budget overruns, and unforeseen logistical challenges tested Blake's resolve. There were moments of doubt, late nights when he questioned whether he was really making a difference or just engaging in an elaborate form of penance for his past actions. But then there were the moments that made it all worthwhile. The day the first family moved into their new affordable apartment, their faces shining with hope and gratitude. The opening of the community center, filled with the sounds of children laughing and adults engaged in lively discussions. The launch of the neighborhood's first small business incubator, supporting local entrepreneurs in pursuing their dreams. As the Riverside project neared completion, it began to attract national attention. Urban planners, politicians, and business leaders from across the country came to study what was being hailed as a new model for equitable urban development. Blake found himself in demand as a speaker and consultant, sharing the lessons learned from the Riverside experiment. He approached this new role with a mixture of pride and humility, always quick to credit the community partners and team members who had made the project possible. But even as Riverside flourished, Blake knew that one successful project wasn't enough. New Haven still faced enormous challenges, and there were other neighborhoods in desperate need of revitalization. The question now was how to scale up his approach, how to create lasting change not just in one community, but across the entire city. As Blake stood on the roof of the newly completed Riverside Community Center, looking out over the neighborhood he'd helped transform, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The journey had been difficult, filled with personal and professional sacrifices. But seeing the positive impact on people's lives, the sense of hope and possibility that now permeated the community, he knew that every hardship had been worth it. The sun was setting over New Haven, casting a warm glow over the city skyline. Blake took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the challenges still to come, but also a profound sense of optimism. He had found his true calling, and he was just getting started. As the Riverside project garnered acclaim, Blake found himself at a crossroads. The success had proven his concept viable, but it had also intensified the scrutiny on his every move. Investors, still wary of his new approach, demanded evidence that this model could be replicated profitably on a larger scale. Community activists, emboldened by the Riverside triumph, pressed for similar transformations in other neglected neighborhoods. Blake knew that the next phase would be crucial. Riverside couldn't be a one-off success story. It needed to be the first step in a citywide renaissance. With this in mind, he convened a series of strategy sessions, bringing together his corporate team, community leaders, urban planning experts, and local officials. These meetings were often contentious, with passionate debates about priorities, resource allocation, and the pace of change. Blake found himself constantly mediating between competing interests, striving to find a balance that would keep all parties engaged and committed to the larger vision. One particularly heated discussion centered on the selection of the next neighborhood for redevelopment. Various factions advocated for their preferred locations, each presenting compelling arguments for why their choice should take precedence. As the debate threatened to descend into acrimony, Blake raised his hand for silence. "I understand everyone's passion," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But we can't let this devolve into a competition between neighborhoods. We need a systematic approach, one that addresses the most pressing needs while also creating a sustainable model for long-term change." He proposed a comprehensive citywide assessment, combining hard data on economic indicators, housing conditions, and social services with input from community members about their needs and aspirations. This would form the basis for a phased redevelopment plan, tackling multiple neighborhoods simultaneously, but at different stages of the process. The proposal was met with cautious approval. It wouldn't satisfy everyone immediately, but it offered a transparent and equitable way forward. Blake tasked Olivia Chun with leading the assessment team, recognizing that her expertise in social work and her connections within various communities would be invaluable. As the assessment got underway, Blake turned his attention to another crucial aspect of his plan: reforming his own company from within. He knew that to truly change the way urban development was done, he needed to reshape the culture and incentives of the corporate world he'd once epitomized. This proved to be one of his most daunting challenges yet. Many of his executives and middle managers were deeply entrenched in the old way of doing business, where profit was the sole measure of success. Blake's new metrics, which balanced financial returns with social impact and community benefits, were met with resistance and skepticism. He began by revamping the company's mission statement and core values, explicitly incorporating social responsibility and community engagement as key pillars. Then came the harder part: aligning compensation and promotion structures with these new priorities. Blake introduced a novel bonus system that factored in social impact alongside traditional financial metrics. Executives were now evaluated not just on the profitability of their projects, but on measures like job creation for local residents, improvement in community health indicators, and resident satisfaction scores. The changes weren't universally popular. Several high-level executives, unable or unwilling to adapt to the new paradigm, left, but their departures made room for a new generation of leaders, many of whom were drawn to the company precisely because of its innovative approach. Among these new recruits was Zahra Malik, a brilliant young urban planner with a background in sustainable development. Blake had met her at a conference where she'd challenged him publicly on some aspects of the Riverside project. Impressed by her passion and expertise, he'd offered her a position on the spot. Zahra quickly became one of Blake's most valued team members, bringing fresh perspectives and cutting-edge ideas to their planning process. Her presence also helped to bridge the gap between the corporate world and the grassroots activists as she moved easily between both spheres. As the citywide assessment neared completion, Blake faced another personal challenge. His estranged wife, Rachel, had filed for divorce. Despite the amicable nature of their separation, the finality of this step hit Blake hard. It forced him to confront the personal cost of his transformation, the relationships and comforts he'd left behind in pursuit of his new mission. One evening, feeling the weight of it all, Blake found himself walking through the streets of Riverside. As he passed by the bustling community center, a voice called out to him. It was Marcus Washington, the man who had first opened Blake's eyes to the realities of life on the streets. "Looks like you've been busy," Marcus said, gesturing at the transformed neighborhood around them. Blake nodded, a mix of pride and weariness in his voice. "It's been quite a journey. Sometimes I wonder if it's all worth it, if I'm really making a difference or just salving my own conscience." Marcus regarded him thoughtfully. "Let me show you something," he said, leading Blake to a nearby park. There, on a warm evening, the park was alive with activity. Children played on new equipment, their laughter filling the air. On benches, elderly residents chatted and watched the scene. A group of young adults was engaged in an impromptu music session, their melodies drifting on the breeze. "You see this?" Marcus said, his voice soft but intense. "This is what hope looks like. This is what happens when people are given a fair chance, when they're treated with dignity. You didn't just build buildings, Blake. You helped rebuild lives." Blake felt a lump form in his throat, overwhelmed by the simple truth of Marcus's words. In that moment, all the doubts and hardships of the past months seemed to fall away, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose. As they walked back, Marcus added, "But don't think your job is done. This is just the beginning, and there's a whole city out there waiting for change." Blake nodded, a determined smile crossing his face. "You're right, and we've got work to do." The next day, energized by his encounter with Marcus, Blake called a company-wide meeting. As his employees gathered, a mix of familiar faces and new recruits, he felt a surge of pride and responsibility. "We stand at a crucial juncture," he began. "What we've achieved in Riverside is remarkable, but it's only the first step. Now, we have the opportunity, no, the obligation, to take this model citywide. It won't be easy. We'll face opposition, setbacks, and moments of doubt. But I believe in this company, in this team, and in the power of what we're doing to transform lives and communities." He went on to outline the results of the citywide assessment and the phase plan for expanding their work to other neighborhoods. As he spoke, he could see the excitement building in the room, the sense of being part of something truly revolutionary. "This isn't just about business anymore," he concluded. "This is about redefining what success means in urban development. It's about proving that profit and social good can go hand in hand. Together, we have the chance to create a blueprint for cities across the country, to show that there's a better way forward." As the meeting ended and his team dispersed, energized and ready to tackle the challenges ahead, Blake felt a profound sense of rightness. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with obstacles and hard choices, but he was no longer alone on this journey. He had built a team, a network, a movement of people committed to positive change. Blake Thompson, once the epitome of ruthless capitalism, had found his true calling as a catalyst for urban transformation. And as he looked out over the city he was helping to rebuild, he knew that the real work was just beginning. As the citywide redevelopment plan moved from concept to implementation, Blake found himself navigating increasingly complex challenges. The scale of the project demanded a delicate balance between ambitious vision and pragmatic execution, all while maintaining the trust of diverse stakeholders. The first major hurdle came in the form of financing. While the Riverside project had proven successful, expanding the model to multiple neighborhoods simultaneously required capital on a whole new level. Traditional investors, still skeptical of Blake's socially conscious approach, were hesitant to commit the necessary funds. Undeterred, Blake and his team began exploring innovative financing models. They developed a hybrid approach that combined private investment, government grants, and a novel community investment program that allowed local residents to buy shares in the developments, ensuring they had a direct stake in the success of their neighborhoods. Zara Malik, proving her worth yet again, suggested partnering with socially responsible investment funds and impact investors who were aligned with their mission. Her network in the sustainable development world proved invaluable as they pieced together a complex but robust financing structure. As the funding came together, Blake turned his attention to the logistical challenges of managing multiple large-scale projects across the city. He restructured his company into specialized teams, each focused on a specific aspect of the redevelopment process, from community engagement and design to construction and social services integration. Olivia Chun, who had proven herself indispensable during the assessment phase, was brought on full-time to head the Community Engagement Division. Her team was tasked with ensuring that local voices remained central to the planning process in each neighborhood. The first wave of new projects broke ground in 3 distinct areas of New Haven: Elmwood, a once thriving industrial area now plagued by abandoned factories and high unemployment; Oakridge, a historically black neighborhood fighting against gentrification; and Riverview, a diverse working-class community struggling with inadequate infrastructure and services. Each neighborhood presented unique challenges and opportunities. In Elmwood, the focus was on adaptive reuse of old industrial buildings, transforming them into mixed-use spaces that could house small businesses, art studios, and affordable apartments. Oakridge required a delicate touch, preserving the area's rich cultural heritage while bringing in much-needed investment and improvements. Riverview's plan centered on infrastructure, upgrades, and the creation of community hubs that could serve the area's multicultural population. As construction began, Blake made a point of being present on the ground in each neighborhood, not as a figurehead, but as an active participant in the process. He attended community meetings, walked the streets with local leaders, and made himself available to hear concerns and ideas directly from residents. This hands-on approach didn't always make his life easier. In Oakridge, he faced intense questioning from longtime residents who feared that despite his promises, the redevelopment would eventually price them out of their homes. One particularly tense town hall meeting saw Blake faced with angry accusations of being a gentrifier in sheep's clothing. Instead of becoming defensive, Blake listened. He invited his harshest critics to join a special advisory board for the Oakridge project, giving them unprecedented access to the decision-making process. It was a risk, but one that ultimately paid off as the community began to take ownership of the redevelopment plans. As the projects progressed, Blake's approach began to attract national attention once again. Urban planners, policymakers, and journalists flocked to New Haven to see firsthand what many were calling a revolution in urban development. Blake found himself increasingly in demand as a speaker and consultant, sharing the lessons learned from New Haven's transformation. But with increased visibility came increased scrutiny. Critics, many funded by competing development interests, began to question the long-term viability of Blake's model. They argued that the focus on social impact would inevitably lead to financial instability, predicting that the whole enterprise would collapse under its own weight. Blake knew that the success or failure of the New Haven experiment could have far-reaching implications for urban development across the country. The pressure to prove the skeptics wrong weighed heavily on him. It was during this period of intense scrutiny that Blake received an unexpected visitor. David Reeves, his former business partner, who had initially been skeptical of Blake's transformation, requested a meeting. As they sat in Blake's office, overlooking a city in the midst of change, David got straight to the point. "I'll admit it, Blake. I thought you'd lost your mind when you started all this. But I've been watching, and, well, I'm impressed. What you're doing here, it's not just good for the city. It's the future of our industry." David went on to propose a partnership. His company had been losing bids to more socially conscious competitors, and he saw collaboration with Blake as a way to reposition themselves in the changing market. "We could take this model national, Blake. Imagine what we could accomplish with our combined resources." The offer was tempting. David's company had the capital and connections to rapidly scale up Blake's approach, potentially transforming cities across the country. But Blake hesitated. He worried about losing control, about the model being diluted or corrupted as it expanded. "I appreciate the offer, David," Blake said carefully, "but I need to think about it. This isn't just a business for me anymore. It's a mission, and I need to be sure that any expansion stays true to the core principles we've established here." As David left, Blake found himself at another crossroads. The opportunity to expand his impact was enticing, but he was acutely aware of the risks involved in rapid growth. He needed perspective, a way to step back and evaluate the bigger picture. Remembering the clarity he'd found during his week on the streets, Blake made a decision. He would spend the next month living in each of the neighborhoods under redevelopment, 1 week at a time, in modest accommodations similar to those being built for local residents. He informed his team of his plans, appointing Zara as acting CEO in his absence. Some thought he was crazy to step away at such a crucial time, but Blake was confident in his team's ability to manage without him. More importantly, he knew he needed this experience to ground himself in the realities of the communities he was trying to serve. Blake's month-long immersion proved to be transformative. In Elmwood, he worked shifts at a newly opened community workshop, learning firsthand about the challenges faced by small business owners and aspiring entrepreneurs. In Oak Ridge, he attended local church services and community events, deepening his understanding of the neighborhood's rich cultural traditions and the importance of preserving them. In Riverview, he tutored at an after-school program, witnessing the impact of improved educational resources on the community's youth. Each experience reinforced his commitment to the holistic, community-centered approach they had developed. He saw how the physical improvements in housing and infrastructure were intertwined with social and economic factors, creating a web of positive change that extended far beyond mere construction projects. But he also encountered ongoing challenges and areas for improvement. In each neighborhood, he heard concerns about long-term affordability, the need for more job opportunities, and the desire for greater community control over future development decisions. As his month of immersion came to an end, Blake returned to his office with renewed energy and a clearer vision for the future. He called a meeting with his executive team, including David Reeves, who had been patiently awaiting his response. "I've made a decision," Blake announced, looking around the room at the faces of those who had joined him on this journey. "We're going to expand our model, but we're going to do it our way. David, I'm grateful for your offer, and I'd like to explore a partnership, but on terms that ensure we stay true to our mission." He went on to outline a plan for controlled expansion, one that prioritized quality and community impact over rapid growth. They would start by partnering with select cities that shared their values and were committed to the long-term success of the model. "Our goal isn't to be the biggest development company out there," Blake concluded. "It's to be the most impactful, to create a new standard for urban development that puts people and communities first. It won't be easy, and it won't happen overnight. But together, I believe we can change the face of cities across this country, one neighborhood at a time." As the meeting ended and the team dispersed, energized by the new direction, Blake stood by the window, looking out over the city he'd helped to transform. He thought about the long journey that had brought him to this point, from ruthless tycoon to homeless wanderer to pioneer of a new urban vision. The road ahead was still long and uncertain, but Blake Thompson was ready for the challenge. He had found his true purpose, not in accumulating wealth or power, but in building communities and changing lives. And as the sun set over New Haven, casting a warm glow over the evolving cityscape, he knew that the real work was just beginning. As Blake's vision for urban transformation began to expand beyond New Haven, new challenges and opportunities emerged. The partnership with David Reeves, while promising, required careful navigation to ensure that the core principles of their approach weren't compromised in the pursuit of growth. Their first joint venture outside of New Haven was in the Rust Belt city of Millbrook, a once thriving industrial center now struggling with widespread unemployment and urban decay. The city's mayor, impressed by the New Haven model, had reached out to Blake personally, seeing a potential lifeline for his beleaguered community. Blake assembled a team for the Millbrook project, drawing on the expertise they developed in New Haven, but also recognizing the need for local knowledge and buy-in. He insisted on a thorough community engagement process before any plans were finalized, a move that initially frustrated David and some of the local officials who were eager for quick results. "We need to understand the unique fabric of this community before we can effectively help rebuild it," Blake explained during a tense planning meeting. "What worked in New Haven won't necessarily work here. We need to listen first." This approach paid dividends as they uncovered nuances about Millbrook that would significantly shape their redevelopment strategy. They learned of a strong maker culture that had emerged in the wake of factory closures, with artisans and small-scale manufacturers repurposing abandoned industrial spaces. This insight led to the incorporation of maker spaces and small business incubators as key components of their plan. They also discovered a deep-seated distrust of outside developers, born from previous failed attempts at urban renewal that had displaced long-time residents. Addressing this required a level of transparency and community involvement that went beyond even what they had done. In New Haven, as the Millbrook project got underway, Blake found himself stretched thin, trying to balance the ongoing work in New Haven with the demands of the new venture. He relied heavily on his team, particularly Zara and Olivia, to keep things running smoothly in his frequent absences. Zara proved especially adept at managing the complex logistics of multi-city operations, streamlining processes and implementing systems that allowed for effective oversight without micromanagement. Olivia's community engagement model, refined through the New Haven experience, became a crucial tool in building trust and collaboration in Millbrook. But as their operations expanded, so did the scrutiny. Critics, some genuinely concerned and others motivated by competing interests, began to question whether the model was truly scalable. They pointed to the intensive community engagement process as unsustainable in the long term and argued that the focus on social impact would inevitably lead to diminished financial returns. Blake found himself increasingly in the public eye, defending their approach in media interviews, at industry conferences, and before skeptical investors. It was a role he hadn't anticipated, and one that often took him away from the on-the-ground work he found most fulfilling. One particularly challenging moment came during a televised debate with Carlton Hayes, a prominent real estate mogul known for his aggressive development tactics. Hayes dismissed Blake's approach as feel-good socialism dressed up as business and argued that true urban renewal required a more hard-nosed, profit-driven approach. Blake, drawing on his experiences, both as a former tycoon and as someone who had lived on the streets, countered with passion and conviction. "Mr. Hayes, I've seen firsthand the human cost of the kind of development you're advocating. I've also seen the incredible potential unleashed when we invest in people and communities, not just buildings and profit margins. Our model isn't just field, it's good business. It creates sustainable growth, reduces long-term social costs, and builds the kind of vibrant, diverse cities that attract further investment and talent." The debate marked a turning point in the public perception of Blake's work. While it didn't silence all critics, it sparked a broader conversation about the role of developers in shaping urban communities and the possibility of a more ethical, community-centered approach to city building. As their reputation grew, Blake and his team found themselves fielding requests from cities across the country, each hoping to become the next success story. It was a heady time, full of possibility, but also fraught with the danger of overextension. In a late-night strategy session with his core team, Blake grappled with the question of how to manage their growth responsibly. "We can't be everywhere at once," he admitted, "and we shouldn't try to be. Our strength lies in our deep engagement with each community we work in. We need to find a way to share a model without diluting its essence." It was Zara who proposed a solution. "What if we created an institute?" she suggested. "A place where we could train other developers, city officials, and community leaders in our methods. We could share our knowledge and experience, create a network of like-minded practitioners, without having to personally oversee every project." The idea took root, evolving into the Urban Renewal and Community Empowerment Institute. Housed in a repurposed factory building in New Haven, the institute became a hub for innovation in urban development, offering courses, workshops, and real-world project experience to a diverse array of participants. Blake took particular pride in the Institute's scholarship program, which provided opportunities for residents from underserved communities to gain the skills and knowledge to lead development efforts in their own neighborhoods. It was a way of ensuring that the movement they were building would be truly inclusive and self-sustaining. As the Institute took shape, Blake found himself reflecting on the long journey that had brought him to this point. He thought about the night he had spent huddled in that alley, cold and alone, and marveled at how that experience had set him on a path he could never have imagined. One evening, as he was leaving the institute after a long day of classes and meetings, he ran into Marcus Washington. Marcus, who had been skeptical of Blake's initial transformation, had become a regular lecturer at the institute, sharing his lived experience and insights with eager students. "You've come a long way from that guy I met on the streets," Marcus observed, a hint of pride in his voice. "But I gotta ask, do you ever miss your old life? The money, the power, the easy answers?" Blake considered the question carefully. "Sometimes," he admitted, "there are days when I miss the simplicity of it all, when success was just a number on a balance sheet. But then I look at what we're building here. The lives we're changing, and I know I could never go back to that. This work, it's hard or messy, often frustrating, but it's real. It matters." Marcus nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Just don't forget to take care of yourself too," he advised. "Can't help others if you're running on empty." The conversation stuck with Blake, prompting him to reflect on the toll the past few years had taken on him personally. He had thrown himself so completely into his work that he had neglected other aspects of his life. His divorce from Rachel had been finalized months ago, but he had barely allowed himself time to process it. Recognizing the wisdom in Marcus's words, Blake made a conscious effort to find better balance. He started setting aside time for personal reflection, rekindled old friendships that had fallen by the wayside, and even cautiously began to explore the possibility of new romantic relationships. This renewed focus on his personal well-being didn't diminish his commitment to the work. If anything, it energized him, allowing him to approach challenges with greater clarity and resilience. As the 5th anniversary of the Riverside Project approached, Blake and his team planned a citywide celebration to commemorate the progress made and to look toward the future. The event would bring together residents from all the transformed neighborhoods, along with civic leaders, institute graduates, and representatives from cities across the country that had adopted their model. Standing on the stage in the packed community center, looking out at the diverse crowd of faces, each representing a life touched by their work, Blake felt a profound sense of accomplishment tinged with humility. He knew that for all they had achieved, there was still so much more to be done. 5 years ago, we embarked on a journey to reimagine what urban development could be, he began, his voice strong and clear. We dared to believe that profit and social good weren't mutually exclusive, that the measure of a city's success lies not in the height of its skyline, but in the strength of its communities. Today, as I look out at all of you, I see that belief vindicated 1,000 times over. He paused, taking in the energy of the room. But our work is far from finished. There are still too many people in this city, in cities across this country, who are left behind by traditional development. Too many communities torn apart, too many lives disrupted in the name of progress. Our challenge now is to take what we've learned, what we've built together, and expand its reach. To create a movement that transforms not just neighborhoods, but the very way we think about cities and community. As applause filled the room, Blake felt a renewed sense of purpose wash over him. The journey that had begun in that cold alley had led him here, to a place he never could have imagined. And as he looked out at the sea of faces, colleagues, friends, community members, all united in a shared vision, he knew that the most exciting chapter of their story was yet to be written. As the celebration wound down and the last of the attendees filtered out of the community center, Blake found himself in a moment of quiet reflection. The energy of the event still buzzed through him, but there was also a sobering realization of the magnitude of the work that lay ahead. The next morning, Blake called an emergency meeting with his core team. As they gathered in the conference room, a mix of excitement and curiosity on their faces, Blake took a deep breath before speaking. "Last night was incredible," he began, "a testament to everything we've achieved. But it also made me realize that we're at a crucial turning point. We've proven our model works here in New Haven and in Millbrook. Now, we have a responsibility to take this to the next level." He laid out his vision for the next phase of their work, a nationwide initiative to transform urban development practices across the country. It was an ambitious plan, one that would require them to leverage every resource and connection they had built over the past 5 years. Zara, ever the pragmatist, was the first to speak up. Blake, I'm all for dreaming big, but this is huge. We're talking about challenging entire systems of urban planning and real estate development that have been in place for decades. Are we ready for that kind of fight? Blake nodded, acknowledging the weight of the challenge. You're right, it won't be easy, but I believe we've built something here that's too important to keep contained. We have a chance to create real, lasting change on a national scale. The team spent the next several hours hashing out the details of the plan. They would start by identifying 10 cities across the country, each facing unique urban challenges to serve as pilot locations for their expanded model. The URCE Institute would play a crucial role, training local teams and providing ongoing support and expertise. Olivia raised a critical point. We need to make sure we're not just parachuting in with pre-made solutions. Each city, each neighborhood will have its own specific needs and cultural contexts. We need to build strong local partnerships from the ground up. Blake agreed wholeheartedly. Absolutely. Our success has always been rooted in community engagement and local empowerment. That won't change as we expand. If anything, it becomes even more crucial. As the meeting concluded, there was a palpable sense of excitement mixed with trepidation. They were about to embark on their most ambitious undertaking yet, one that would test the limits of their model and their resolve. Over the next few months, Blake and his team threw themselves into the work of launching their national initiative. They reached out to contacts in city governments, community organizations, and socially conscious investment firms across the country. The response was overwhelming, with far more cities expressing interest than they had initially planned for. The process of selecting the 10 pilot cities was grueling. They sought a diverse mix of urban environments, from struggling post-industrial cities to rapidly gentrifying tech hubs, each presenting unique challenges and opportunities. After weeks of analysis and debate, they finalized their list. Detroit, Oakland, New Orleans, Pittsburgh, Miami, St. Louis, Baltimore, Atlanta, Portland, and Phoenix. As they prepared to launch projects in each of these cities, Blake insisted on personally visiting each location, meeting with local leaders and community members to begin building the relationships that would be crucial to their success. It was an exhausting schedule, but one that Blake found invigorating. In Detroit, he walked through neighborhoods of abandoned factories and met with grassroots organizations already working to revitalize their communities. In Oakland, he engaged in intense discussions with activists fighting against gentrification and displacement. In New Orleans, he witnessed firsthand the ongoing struggles of neighborhoods still recovering from natural disasters and systemic neglect. Each city left a profound impact on Blake, deepening his understanding of the complex challenges facing urban America and reinforcing his commitment to their mission. But it was in Baltimore where he encountered a situation that would test the limits of their model and force them to confront difficult questions about the nature of urban transformation. The neighborhood they had identified for their Baltimore project, Westport, had a long history of disinvestment and neglect. It also had a tight-knit community with a deep distrust of outside developers, born from decades of broken promises and failed renewal efforts. At a contentious town hall meeting, Blake faced a hostile crowd, with many residents openly skeptical of his intentions. One community elder, Mrs. Evelyn Davis, stood up and silenced the room with her powerful voice. "Mr. Thompson," she said, fixing Blake with a penetrating gaze, "we've heard pretty words from men like you. You come in here talking about renewal and opportunity, but all we've ever seen is our people pushed out, our history erased. Why should we believe you're any different?" The room fell silent, all eyes on Blake. It was a moment of truth, one that would define their entire approach in Baltimore and potentially impact their national initiative. Blake took a moment before responding, weighing his words carefully. "Mrs. Davis, you're absolutely right to be skeptical. I can't undo the harm that's been done to this community in the past, and I won't insult you by making promises I can't keep. What I can offer is this. We're here to work with you. not for you or despite you. If this community doesn't want us here, we'll leave. But if you're willing to give us a chance, I promise you'll have a seat at every table, a voice in every decision. This will be your project, shaped by your vision for Westport's future." He went on to propose a unique arrangement. Before any development plans were drawn up, they would spend 6 months working alongside local organizations, helping to address immediate community needs and building relationships. Only after that period, if the community chose to move forward, would they begin discussing redevelopment plans, MRs. Davis and other community leaders caucused briefly before responding. 6 months, Mrs. Davis said firmly. "We'll be watching you closely, Mr. Thompson. Don't let us down." This approach in Baltimore, born out of necessity, became a model for how they engaged with communities in all their new projects. The emphasis on building trust and demonstrating commitment before any physical redevelopment began marked a significant evolution in their methodology. As word of their national initiative spread, Blake found himself thrust into the national spotlight like never before. He was invited to testify before congressional committees on urban policy, interviewed on major news networks, and sought after as a keynote speaker at high-profile conferences. While the increased visibility helped to amplify their message and attract more partners and supporters, it also intensified the pushback from those with vested interests in maintaining the status quo. Real estate lobbyists and traditional developers launched coordinated campaigns to discredit their approach, arguing that it was economically unsustainable and would stifle urban growth. Blake refused to be drawn into public mudslinging matches, instead focusing on showcasing the tangible results of their work. He invited skeptics to visit their projects, to speak with community members whose lives had been impacted. Slowly but surely, they began to shift the narrative. One unexpected ally emerged in the form of Senator Michael Reeves, David's younger brother and a rising star in national politics. Michael had been skeptical of his brother's partnership with Blake at first, but after visiting several of their projects and seeing the impact firsthand, he became a vocal advocate for their approach on Capitol Hill. With Michael's support, they began to make inroads in shaping national urban policy. They pushed for reforms in housing regulations, advocated for increased funding for community development initiatives, and worked to create incentives for socially responsible urban investment. As their work expanded and their influence grew, Blake found himself grappling with the pressures of leadership on a national stage. The constant travel, the high-stakes negotiations, the relentless public scrutiny, it all took a toll. There were nights when he lay awake, overwhelmed by the weight of expectation and the fear of letting down the communities that had put their trust in him. It was during one of these moments of doubt that Blake received an unexpected call from Rachel, his ex-wife. They hadn't spoken in months, their divorce having created a chasm between them that seemed unbridgeable. "I saw you on the news," Rachel said, her voice softer than he remembered. "What you're doing? It's remarkable, Blake. I didn't understand before, but I do now. I'm proud of you." The conversation was brief, but it left Blake with a sense of closure and renewed purpose. He realized that while he had lost something in his personal life, he had gained something far greater, a calling that gave his life true meaning. As the first year of their national initiative drew to a close, Blake gathered his team for a retreat to reflect on their progress and plan for the future. They had faced numerous challenges and setbacks, but they had also achieved remarkable successes. In each of their pilot cities, they were seeing the first fruits of their labor, communities coming together, local economies beginning to revitalize, hope taking root where once there had been only despair. Sitting around a campfire on the final night of the retreat, Blake looked at the faces of his team, Zara, Olivia, David, and all the others who had joined their mission along the way. He felt a profound sense of gratitude and responsibility. "We've come so far," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "but our journey is really just beginning. What we're doing isn't just about buildings or neighborhoods or even cities. It's about reimagining the very fabric of our society, about creating a world where everyone has the opportunity to thrive. It won't be easy, and there will be times when it seems impossible. But together, I believe we can make it happen." As the fire crackled and sparks drifted up into the starry sky, Blake Thompson, once a symbol of ruthless capitalism, now a catalyst for social change, felt a deep sense of peace. He had found his true purpose, and though the road ahead was long and uncertain, he was ready to walk it one step at a time with a community of dedicated allies by his side. As the national initiative entered its second year, Blake and his team faced new challenges that tested the resilience and adaptability of their model. The honeymoon phase was over, and the real work of sustaining long-term change in diverse urban environments was underway. In Detroit, their efforts to repurpose abandoned factories into mixed-use spaces combining affordable housing, small business incubators, and community centers hit a snag when contamination from decades of industrial use was discovered in the soil. The cleanup costs threatened to derail the entire project, putting Blake's commitment to environmental responsibility at odds with financial feasibility. Meanwhile, in Oakland, tensions flared between longtime residents and newcomers attracted by the improving neighborhood conditions. Despite their best efforts to prevent displacement, the success of their initial projects had inadvertently sparked a wave of speculative buying in surrounding areas. These challenges forced Blake and his team to revisit and refine their approach. They realized that true urban transformation required thinking beyond individual neighborhoods to address citywide systems and policies. In response to the Detroit situation, they partnered with environmental engineers and local universities to develop innovative, cost-effective remediation techniques. This not only saved the project, but also created a model for dealing with similar brownfield sites across the Rust Belt. To address the gentrification pressures in Oakland, they worked with city officials to implement new zoning laws and community land trust models that would help preserve affordability and community ownership in the long term. These policy-level interventions became a crucial component of their approach in all their project cities. As they grappled with these evolving challenges, Blake found an unexpected source of support and inspiration in Amar Johnson, a brilliant young urban planner he had met at a conference in Chicago. Amar's fresh perspective and deep understanding of the intersections between urban design, social justice, and economic development proved invaluable. Blake was drawn to Amara's passion and intellect, and as they worked closely together on various projects, a personal connection began to develop. However, mindful of the complexities of workplace relationships and the intense scrutiny he was under, Blake was hesitant to pursue anything beyond a professional partnership. Amara, sensing his reservations, took the initiative during a late-night strategy session. "Blake," she said, setting aside her laptop, "I think we need to address the elephant in the room. There's clearly something between us, and I don't think we should ignore it just because of work." Blake was taken aback by her directness, but also relieved. "You're right," he admitted. "I've been feeling it too. But I'm worried about complications, about how it might affect the work we're doing." Amara smiled. "Life is complicated, Blake. Our work is about creating better, more humane cities. Don't you think that should include allowing ourselves to be human too?" Her words struck a chord with Blake. He realized that in his dedication to the mission, he had been holding part of himself back, afraid to embrace personal happiness. With Amara, he saw the possibility of a partnership that could enhance both his personal life and their shared professional goals. As their relationship developed, Blake found that Amara's presence in his life brought a new balance and perspective to his work. She challenged him intellectually, supported him emotionally, and reminded him of the importance of joy and human connection in the midst of their often overwhelming mission. The personal growth Blake experienced through his relationship with Amara had a positive ripple effect on his leadership style and decision-making. He became more open to vulnerability, more willing to admit when he didn't have all the answers, and more attuned to the emotional needs of his team and the communities they served. This shift became particularly important as they faced one of their biggest challenges yet in New Orleans. Their project in the lower 9th Ward, an area still struggling to recover from Hurricane Katrina, had been making steady progress when a new threat emerged. A powerful real estate conglomerate, seeing the potential for profit in the rejuvenated neighborhood. began aggressively buying up properties and pressuring residents to sell. The situation quickly escalated, with community members feeling betrayed and fearful of losing their homes. Local media picked up the story, painting Blake's organization as unwitting accomplices in a land grab. Faced with this crisis, Blake's first instinct was to launch into damage control mode to protect the reputation of the project and the organization. But Amara encouraged him to take a different approach. "This isn't about us, Blake," she reminded him. "It's about the community. We need to stand with them, even if it means going up against powerful interests." Taking her advice to heart, Blake called an emergency community meeting. Instead of delivering a prepared statement, he opened the floor to residents, listening as they voiced their fears, anger, and disappointment. When he finally spoke, his words came from a place of genuine empathy and resolve. "I hear you," he said, his voice carrying throughout the packed church. "And I want you to know that we are with you in this fight. This is your community, your home. We made a promise to work alongside you, not just to improve buildings, but to build a stronger, more resilient neighborhood." That promise doesn't end when developers come knocking. Blake committed to using every resource at their disposal to help the community resist unwanted development. They brought in pro bono legal support to help residents understand their rights, worked with local officials to strengthen anti-displacement policies, and used their media connections to shine a national spotlight on the situation. The battle in New Orleans became a defining moment for Blake's organization. It showcased their willingness to stand up to powerful interests and their commitment to community empowerment above all else. The experience also led to the development of more robust anti-displacement strategies that were implemented across all their projects. As news of their stand in New Orleans spread, it galvanized support for their work nationwide. More cities reached out, eager to partner with an organization that had proven its dedication to genuine community-led development. However, the increased prominence also brought intensified opposition. Traditional developers and their political allies, seeing Blake's model as a threat to their interests, launched a coordinated campaign to discredit him and his organization. They dug into Blake's past, trying to paint his transformation as a calculated move rather than a genuine change of heart. They commissioned studies questioning the economic viability of his projects and lobbied against policy changes that would facilitate his approach to urban development. The attacks took a toll on Blake, despite the thick skin he had developed over the years. The constant barrage of criticism and the twisting of his intentions wore on him. There were nights when he questioned whether the fight was worth it, whether he was really making a difference or just tilting at windmills. It was during one of these moments of doubt that Marcus Washington, the man who had first opened Blake's eyes to life on the streets, paid him a surprise visit. "Heard you've been taking some heat," Marcus said, settling into a chair in Blake's office. Blake nodded wearily. "Sometimes I wonder if we're really changing anything, Marcus. For every step forward, it feels like we're being pushed 2 steps back." Marcus leaned forward, his eyes intense. "Let me tell you something, Blake. Last week, I was back in Riverside, talking to folks I knew from the old days. You know what I saw? I saw kids playing in safe parks that used to be drug corners. I saw people coming home from jobs they got through your training programs. I saw a community that is hope again." He paused, letting his words sink in. "You can't measure that in dollars or statistics. What you're doing, it's changing lives. Don't you ever forget that." Marcus's words served as a powerful reminder of why Blake had embarked on this journey in the first place. Reinvigorated, he called a meeting with his core team to strategize their response to the mounting opposition. "We've been playing defense," he told them, "reacting to attacks and trying to justify our work. It's time we change the narrative. We need to go on the offensive, not against our critics, but for our vision of what cities can be." Over the next few months, they launched a bold public education campaign. Instead of simply defending their projects, they challenged the fundamental assumptions of traditional urban development. They showcased the stories of individuals and communities transformed by their work, presented hard data on the economic and social benefits of their approach, and articulated a compelling vision for the future of American cities. Blake became a regular presence on news programs and at public forums, not just talking about their specific projects, but engaging in a broader conversation about urban policy, economic justice, and the meaning of community in the 21st century. As their message spread, they began to see a shift in public discourse. More people were questioning the status quo of urban development, demanding approaches that prioritize community needs and long-term sustainability over short-term profit. Politicians on both sides of the aisle started incorporating elements of their model into their platforms. Urban planning programs at universities reached out to collaborate on research and to integrate their methodologies into their curricula. As the second year of their national initiative drew to a close, Blake found himself reflecting on the incredible journey that had brought him to this point. From a ruthless real estate tycoon to a homeless wanderer to a pioneer of socially responsible urban development, it was a transformation he could never have imagined. Sitting in his office late one evening, he pulled out the tattered coat he had worn during his week on the streets, kept as a reminder of where this all began. As he ran his fingers over the worn fabric, he felt a profound sense of gratitude and purpose. A knock on the door interrupted his reverie. It was Amara, a concerned look on her face. "Blake, you need to see this," she said, handing him a tablet. On the screen was a breaking news alert. A massive hurricane was bearing down on the Gulf Coast, with New Orleans directly in its path. All the work they had done, all the progress they had made in the lower Ninth Ward and beyond, was now under threat. Blake met Amara's gaze, seeing his own mix of determination and apprehension reflected in her eyes. Without a word, they both knew what needed to be done. This would be their greatest challenge yet, a test of everything they had built and believed in. As they rushed to mobilize their team and resources, Blake felt a familiar surge of energy. This was why they had worked so hard, why they had fought against seemingly insurmountable odds. It wasn't just about buildings or neighborhoods. It was about creating resilient communities that could weather any storm, literal or metaphorical. The road ahead would be difficult, but Blake Thompson was ready. With Amara by his side and a dedicated team behind him, he prepared to face whatever challenges lay ahead, committed as ever to their vision of cities that worked for all their residents. As the first reports of the hurricane's landfall began to come in, Blake took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and stepped forward into the next chapter of their ongoing story. As the hurricane bore down on New Orleans, Blake and his team sprang into action. Their experience in community organizing and their deep connections in the city proved invaluable as they coordinated with local officials, emergency services, and grassroots organizations to prepare for the impending disaster. Blake insisted on being on the ground in New Orleans, despite the risks. "We made a commitment to this community," he told Amara as they boarded a last-minute flight. "We need to be there with them through this." The scene that greeted them upon arrival was one of controlled chaos. The lower Ninth Ward, still bearing scars from Hurricane Katrina, was a hive of activity as residents boarded up homes and businesses and helped elderly neighbors evacuate. Blake was struck by the stark contrast between the community's response now and what he had read about during Katrina. The networks of mutual aid and support that they had helped foster over the past 2 years were clearly visible, with residents working together in an organized, efficient manner. As the outer bands of the hurricane began to lash the city, Blake and Amara found themselves at the community center they had helped build. Now serving as an emergency shelter, the building was filled with families seeking refuge from the storm. Throughout the night, as the wind howled and rain pounded against the reinforced windows, Blake moved among the sheltered residents, offering words of comfort and support. He was heartened to see how the community pulled together, sharing resources and caring for one another. Mars. Evelyn Davis, the community elder who had initially been skeptical of Blake's intentions, approached him as he was distributing blankets. "You kept your word, Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice barely audible above the storm. "You didn't abandon us when things got tough. That means something." Her words touched Blake deeply, reinforcing his commitment to the community and the work they were doing. As dawn broke and the hurricane moved inland, the full extent of the damage became apparent. While their reinforced buildings had weathered the storm well, many older structures in the neighborhood had suffered significant damage. The streets were flooded, power lines were down, and debris littered the area. But even in the face of this devastation, Blake saw something remarkable. Before official recovery efforts could even begin, residents were already out in the streets, checking on neighbors, clearing debris, and beginning the process of rebuilding. Blake quickly realized that their role now was to support and amplify these grassroots efforts. He got on the phone with his contacts in city government and relief organizations, advocating for resources to be directed to community-led recovery initiatives. In the weeks that followed, the Lower Ninth Ward became a model for community-driven disaster recovery. The networks and infrastructure Blake's organization had helped build proved crucial in coordinating aid, identifying needs, and ensuring that recovery efforts were equitable and responsive to community priorities. National media picked up on the story, contrasting the community's resilience and effective response with the chaos that had followed Katrina. Blake found himself in the spotlight once again, but this time he was determined to shift the focus to the real heroes, the residents who were rebuilding their community with their own hands. As he stood for interviews in front of volunteer crews clearing debris, Blake emphasized a key point. What you're seeing here isn't just about disaster response. It's about the power of invested, connected communities. When people have a real stake in their neighborhood, when they're empowered and supported, they become the first and best line of defense against any challenge. Whether it's a hurricane or economic hardship, the success of the Lower Ninth Ward's recovery efforts had far-reaching implications. City officials from across the country reached out, eager to learn how they could foster similar community resilience in their own cities. Blake and his team found themselves advising on disaster preparedness plans that went far beyond traditional infrastructure concerns, focusing on building social cohesion and community capacity. This experience also led to a significant evolution in their overall approach to urban development. They began to place even greater emphasis on building resilience, not just in terms of physical infrastructure, but in terms of social and economic networks that could help communities weather various shocks and stresses. As recovery efforts in New Orleans transitioned into long-term rebuilding, Blake found himself at another crossroads. The demand for their expertise and approach had grown exponentially, with requests coming in from cities facing a wide array of challenges, from climate change threats to economic decline to rapid gentrification. During a strategy session with his core team, Blake posed a critical question. How do we scale our impact without losing the community-centered approach that's at the heart of everything we do? The ensuing discussion was intense, with team members passionately debating various approaches. Some argued for rapidly expanding their direct operations to more cities, while others advocated for focusing on policy change at the national level. It was Zara who proposed a hybrid solution. What if we create a network? She suggested. We can't be everywhere at once, but we can share our knowledge and approach with local organizations and leaders who are already embedded in their communities. We provide the framework, the expertise, and the connections, while they provide the local knowledge and relationships. The idea resonated with Blake. It aligned with their core principle of empowering communities to lead their own development, while also offering a way to dramatically expand their impact. Over the next several months, they worked to develop what would become the Urban Resilience Network, URN. The network would bring together community organizations, local governments, socially responsible businesses, and academic institutions, all committed to a shared vision of equitable, resilient urban development. Through the URN, Blake's organization would provide training, resources, and ongoing support to local partners, helping them implement tried and tested strategies while also encouraging innovation tailored to local contexts. A digital platform would facilitate knowledge sharing and collaboration across the network, allowing successes and lessons learned in one city to quickly benefit others. The launch of the URN marked a new phase in Blake's journey. While he remained deeply involved in the day-to-day work of their flagship projects, He also embraced a new role as a connector and catalyst for a broader movement. This shift brought new challenges, particularly in maintaining the integrity of their approach as it was adopted and adapted in diverse contexts. Blake insisted on a rigorous accreditation process for network members, ensuring that all partners truly embrace the core principles of community empowerment and social responsibility. As the network grew, Blake found himself traveling more than ever, speaking at conferences, meeting with local leaders, and witnessing firsthand the impact of their work in communities across the country. It was exhausting but deeply fulfilling work. During one such trip, as he walked through a revitalized neighborhood in Pittsburgh with a local urban partner, Blake was struck by a powerful realization. The changes he was seeing, the vibrant community spaces, the mix of affordable housing and local businesses, the sense of pride and ownership among residents were remarkably similar to what he had first envisioned on that fateful night in the alley years ago. But there was a crucial difference. These changes weren't the result of his vision alone, but of thousands of people working together, each contributing their own insights, efforts, and dreams to the collective project of reimagining their cities. That evening, back in his hotel room, Blake called Amara. As they talked about the day's events and their plans for the future, he felt a deep sense of contentment. He had found not just purpose, but partnership, both in his personal life with Amara and in the broader sense with the countless individuals and communities that were now part of their growing movement. As the urn continued to expand, it began to attract international attention. Cities from Europe, Asia, and Africa reached out, eager to learn from and contribute to this new model of urban development. Blake and his team carefully considered how to engage globally while staying true to their community-centered approach. They decided to start with a series of international knowledge exchange programs, bringing urban leaders and community activists from around the world to see their projects firsthand and share their own experiences and insights. During one such exchange, Blake found himself in a vibrant discussion with urban planners from Lagos, community organizers from Medellin, and city officials from Amsterdam. As they debated the universal challenges of urbanization and the unique contexts of their respective cities, Blake was struck by the power of this global dialogue. We're all grappling with the same fundamental questions, he realized. How do we create cities that are equitable, sustainable, and resilient? How do we balance growth with community preservation? There's so much we can learn from each other. This global perspective brought new depth and dimension to their work. They began to incorporate innovative practices from around the world, like participatory budgeting models from Brazil and cooperative housing schemes from Germany, adapting them to fit the American context. As the URN's influence grew, it began to shape policy discussions at the highest levels. Blake was invited to testify before the United Nations Habitat Conference on Sustainable Urbanization, sharing the network's experiences and advocating for a more community-centered approach to global urban development challenges. Standing at the podium, addressing delegates from around the world, Blake couldn't help but reflect on the incredible journey that had brought him to this point. From a ruthless real estate tycoon to a homeless man on the streets to a leader in a global movement for urban transformation. It was a path he could never have imagined. As he concluded his speech, Blake emphasized a point that had become the core of his philosophy. The future of our cities doesn't lie in top-down planning or profit-driven development. It lies in the wisdom, creativity, and power of communities themselves. Our job is not to build cities for people, but to empower people to build the cities they dream of. The applause that followed was thunderous. But for Blake, the real measure of success lay elsewhere. It was in the countless lives touched by their work, in the communities transformed not just physically, but socially and economically, in the new generation of urban leaders they were helping to nurture. As he left the conference hall, Blake's phone buzzed with a message from Amara. Attached was a photo from one of their earliest projects, a group of children playing in a community garden that had once been an abandoned lot. The caption read, "This is why we do what we do. Never forget." Blake smiled, feeling a renewed surge of energy and purpose. The work was far from over. There were still challenges to face, battles to be fought, communities to be uplifted. But he was no longer alone in this mission. He was part of a growing movement, a network of dedicated individuals and communities, all working towards a shared vision of more just, vibrant, and resilient cities. As he headed to the airport for his flight home, Blake Thompson felt a profound sense of gratitude and hope. The journey that had begun in that cold alley years ago had led him here, to a place where he could truly make a difference in the world. And though the road ahead was long and undoubtedly filled with new challenges, he was ready to face whatever came next, armed with the lessons of the past and the strength of the communities he served. The story of Blake Thompson and the Urban Resilience Network was far from over. In many ways, it was just beginning. As the Urban Resilience Network, URN, entered its 5th year of operation, the landscape of urban development had shifted dramatically. Cities across the country, and increasingly around the world, were adopting elements of the URN model, prioritizing community engagement, social equity, and long-term resilience in their planning processes. Blake, now in his early 50s, found himself at the helm of a movement that had grown far beyond his initial vision. The small team that had started in New Haven had evolved into a global network of thousands of urban practitioners, community leaders, and policymakers, all working towards a shared goal of creating more just and sustainable cities. However, with this growth and success came new challenges and responsibilities. As Blake sat in his office, reviewing reports from URN projects around the world, he felt the weight of expectations from the communities they served, and the eyes of the world watching their every move. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Zara, now the co of the organization, with a concerned look on her face. "Blake, we need to talk," she said, closing the door behind her. "There's a situation developing in Chicago that needs your attention." The Chicago project had been one of their most ambitious yet, a comprehensive plan to revitalize several struggling neighborhoods on the city's south side. But now, it seemed, they were facing significant pushback from an unexpected source. "A group of local activists is accusing us of facilitating gentrification," Zara explained. "They're saying our efforts are driving up property values and pushing out long-time residents." Despite our affordability measures, Blake felt a knot form in his stomach. This was precisely the kind of outcome they had always fought to prevent. "Give me the details," he said, leaning forward in his chair. As Zara laid out the situation, Blake realized they were facing a complex challenge that struck at the heart of their mission. The improvements they had brought to the neighborhood, better housing, new businesses, improved public spaces, had indeed made the area more desirable. Despite their best efforts to maintain affordability and prioritize existing residents, market forces were threatening to undermine their work. "We need to go to Chicago," Blake decided. "This isn't something we can solve from a distance. We need to meet with the community, hear their concerns firsthand, and work together to find a solution." Within days, Blake and a small team were on the ground in Chicago, meeting with community leaders, local officials, and the activists who had raised the alarm. The discussions were often tense, with emotions running high on all sides. During a particularly heated community meeting, a young activist named Jamal stood up, his voice shaking with anger. "You say you're here to help, but all I see is my neighbors being priced out of their homes. How is that different from the developers you claim to be fighting against?" Blake didn't try to deflect or defend. Instead, he listened, really listened, to Jamal and others who shared similar concerns. He realized that despite their best intentions, they had missed something crucial in their approach. After days of intense discussions and soul-searching, Blake called a press conference. Standing before a crowd of residents, activists, and media, he made an announcement that would mark another turning point in the URN's evolution. "We came to Chicago with the best of intentions," he began, "but good intentions aren't enough. We've heard your concerns, and you're right. We need to do better. Starting today, we're putting all of our Chicago projects on hold while we work with the community to develop a new approach that truly protects against displacement and ensures that the benefits of neighborhood improvement are shared equitably." He went on to outline a series of commitments: stricter anti-displacement measures, a community-controlled land trust to maintain long-term affordability, expanded local hiring and job training programs, and a seat for community representatives on the project's governing board. The announcement sent shockwaves through the urban development world. Critics saw it as an admission of failure, while others hailed it as a bold step towards genuine accountability and community control. For Blake, it was a necessary recalibration. "We've always said that we're here to work with communities, not impose solutions on them," he told Amara that night over the phone. "This is us living up to that promise." Even when it's difficult, the Chicago experience catalyzed a period of deep reflection and reimagining within the URN. Blake initiated a comprehensive review of all their projects, looking for ways to strengthen community ownership and control. They developed new tools for measuring and mitigating displacement risks, and expanded their focus on building local economic ecosystems that could withstand outside pressures. This process of self-examination and adaptation reinvigorated the network. Partners around the world shared their own challenges and innovations, leading to a flood of new ideas and approaches. As the URN worked to implement these changes, Blake found himself grappling with questions of legacy and succession. He was immensely proud of what they had built, but he also recognized the need to ensure that the movement could thrive beyond his personal involvement. It was during this period of reflection that Blake received news that brought his journey full circle. Marcus Washington, the man who had first opened his eyes to the realities of homelessness all those years ago, had passed away. The news hit Blake hard. Marcus had remained a friend and occasional advisor over the years, always there to provide a grounding perspective when Blake needed it most. Attending the memorial service in New Haven, Blake was struck by the outpouring of love and respect from the community. Marcus, in his own quiet way, had touched countless lives. As he listened to stories about Marcus's life and impact, Blake had an epiphany. The true measure of their work wasn't in buildings constructed or policies changed, but in the lives transformed and the communities empowered. Marcus had understood this intrinsically, and it was a lesson Blake vowed to keep at the heart of everything they did moving forward. Inspired by Marcus's legacy, Blake embarked on a new initiative within the URN. They established the Marcus Washington Fellowship, a program designed to identify and support emerging leaders from underserved communities, providing them with the training, resources, and network to drive positive change in their own neighborhoods. The first cohort of fellows brought a surge of new energy and perspectives to the network. Blake found himself energized by their passion and fresh ideas, seeing in them the future of the movement he had helped to build. As the URN approached its 10th anniversary, Blake knew it was time to begin stepping back from day-to-day operations. He worked closely with the board to implement a transition plan, gradually handing over responsibilities to a new generation of leaders who had grown up within the organization. Zara was the natural choice to take over as CEO, her strategic mind and unwavering commitment to the mission, making her the perfect person to lead the URN into its next chapter. Blake would remain involved as a board member and advisor, but the day-to-day leadership would pass to those who would shape the future of urban development in the decades to come. On the day of the official leadership transition, Blake found himself back in Riverside, the New Haven neighborhood where it had all begun. Walking the streets with Amara by his side, he marveled at the changes he saw, not just in the physical landscape, but in the spirit of the community. Children played in parks that had once been vacant lots. Local businesses thrived where boarded-up storefronts had stood. Most importantly, there was a palpable sense of pride and ownership among the residents. A community that had come together to shape its own destiny. As they stopped by the community center, now a bustling hub of activity, Blake was approached by a young woman. "Mayor Thompson," she said, "I don't know if you remember me, but I grew up in one of the first affordable housing units you built here. I just wanted to thank you. The opportunities I had because of that stable home, they changed my life. I'm an urban planner now, working to bring the same kind of positive change to other communities." Blinking back tears, Blake thanked her for sharing her story. It was moments like these that made every struggle, every setback worth it. That evening, at a small gathering to mark the leadership transition, Blake raised a toast to the past and future of the URN, looking around at the faces of his colleagues, friends, and the new generation of leaders. He felt a profound sense of hope and gratitude. "When I started this journey, I thought I was setting out to change cities," he said. "But in truth, it was the cities, the communities, the people that changed me. What we've built together is more than an organization or a network. It's a movement, a new way of thinking about what cities can be and how we can shape them together." He paused, looking out at the New Haven skyline visible through the windows. "The work is far from over. There will always be challenges to face, injustices to fight, communities in need of support. But I have faith in all of you, in this movement we've built together, to continue pushing for cities that are more just, more resilient, more human." As applause filled the room, Blake felt a sense of completion. The journey that had begun in that cold alley had led him here, to a place he could never have imagined. He had found his purpose, made a real difference in the world, and now was passing the torch to a new generation ready to take the vision even further. Blake Thompson, once a symbol of ruthless capitalism, had become a catalyst for a revolution in urban development. And though his role was changing, he knew that the story of the Urban Resilience Network and the movement it represented was really just beginning. As he and Amara left the gathering, walking hand in hand into the vibrant city night, Blake felt a profound sense of peace. Whatever challenges the future held, he was ready to face them, not alone, but as part of a global community dedicated to building better cities and a better world for all. If you enjoyed this story, we'd love for you to support us by leaving a like and subscribing to our Slices of Life channel. We'd also love to hear from you in the comments. Which city are you talking about? It's very rewarding for us to provide our followers with an enjoyable moment. We appreciate the unconditional support you show us in every story. Blessings!